The lights went on in Bahrain for the very first time this season, bringing all the excitement and anticipation to a climax. Aston Martin stole the show by proving just how much of a competitive car that they've built this year, and how far that they've progressed since last year. This means a new challenge for Red Bull's title ambitions, and they are worried to say the least. The Red Bull camp isn't happy with the Aston Martin AMR23, but why? Stay tuned to find out. To begin, Aston Martin demonstrated a noteworthy performance at the Bahrain Grand Prix. Fernando Alonso got his first podium of this season with the team after finishing third, and his teammate Lance Stroll came in sixth. Many are speculating as to whether this could be the beginning of something great after Alonso masterfully and skillfully maneuvered the AMR23 to a third-place finish. For a team that barely made it out of Q3 last year, that's a pretty big leap. So, how did they do it? What changes were made to enable them to become the second fastest on the grid as of now? And most importantly, why is Red Bull wary of this? It's important to note that Red Bull has a competitive car this year as well, and that they are their own competition. No other team has been able to achieve what Red Bull has since the 2022 regulation changes. The team, led by current and two-time world champion Max Verstappen, appeared to have a bigger lead over the rest of the grid in this year's season opener than it did at the end of 2022. After bagging a 1-2 finish, it's only the start of the season, and they've managed to convince Mercedes driver George Russell that they're on a whole new level. While talking about Red Bull, Russell had this to say: "Red Bull has got this championship sewn up. I don't think anyone is going to be fighting with them this year. I expect that they should win every single race this season. That's my bet." So why is Red Bull worried about Aston Martin's performance when all odds seem to be in their favor? We can say that one of the important events in the build-up to this predicament was Dan Fallows moving from Red Bull to Aston Martin. The story began last year at the Spanish Grand Prix. Aston Martin brought upgrades to the AMR22, a move that earned the car the Green Red Bull title. This is because they ditched the bulky side pod design that the car had in favor of design similar to that of the Red Bull RB18. That didn't go unnoticed, and it caused worry at Red Bull. An internal investigation was started to determine if there were any intellectual property leaks. And much to Aston Martin's relief, none were found. The next best explanation was Fallows' involvement with Aston Martin, and he had previously worked at Red Bull. Aston Martin was quick to quash those claims, or squash, or quell, or whatever word was supposed to be there, making it very clear that they have been working very hard on their design long before Fallows joined them. The matter wasn't pursued further by Red Bull due to the fact that despite the significant improvement that Aston Martin showed toward the end of the 2022 season, they were nowhere near close to challenging the RB18. Things have changed this year, and the AMR23 seems a worthy title challenger and looks similar to both the RB18 and RB19 to a large extent. And this has Red Bull worried. The fact is that Fallows can be credited largely for the car's design. Next, what are the similarities between the Red Bull RB19, RB18, and the Aston Martin AMR23? The similarities between these three challengers are pretty obvious, and they've been noted by a number of senior Red Bull figures. This has set tongues a-wagging and accusations of flying, albeit shrouded in humor. Sergio Perez couldn't resist taking a jab at Aston Martin. He said that it was great to have 3 Red Bull cars on the podium during the post-race conference. It was enjoyable to see Fernando up there. It gives the 40-somethings hope, like that there's life in the old boy yet. He raced very well, so he's still so competitive. And the Aston car looks like a good car. Based on one race, you'd have to say that they were the second strongest here. They've obviously done a good job over the winter. They say imitation is the biggest form of flattery, and it's good to see the old car doing so well. Red Bull team principal Christian Horner said after the race. Even Franz Tost, a team principal of the Red Bull-owned AlphaTauri, had something similar to say. The Aston Martin looks like the Red Bull because Aston Martin took half of the aerodynamic employees from Red Bull. Of course, they built the same car and they painted it green. But can Red Bull formally accuse Aston Martin of copying their car? First of all, sharing ideas in F1 is common and very legal. There are regulations and there are guidelines on what parts of the cars and designs can be shared between teams and those that are required to be unique to every team. These regulations were tightened in 2020 after Aston Martin, who at the time went by the name Racing Point, showed up with a car that looked identical to the 2019 championship-winning Mercedes, the W10. This sparked talk in the paddock, and most people weren't happy with what they had done with it. The team admitted that they had been greatly inspired by the W10, which made the other teams question the legality of the car and subsequently forced them to involve the FIA. An investigation was carried out, and the findings were that Racing Point only had one illegal part that was from Mercedes and was fined a small amount of money and given a deduction of points for that. To the disappointment of the teams, they were allowed to keep the part, even when it was obvious that it gave them an advantage. Copying their competitor's car was deemed legal by the FIA. However, regulations that were introduced as a consequence of that restricted the teams from using any pictures, 3D photography, as well as any stereographic projection and scanning techniques to try and reverse engineer parts of a competitor's car. Now, this is where the dilemma over intellectual property and knowledge comes in. In the last 2 years, we've witnessed a lot of changes in employees on different teams. Engineers and other staff have left from one team to another. Notably, that was the poaching that Aston Martin did when they took follows from Red Bull along with other staff members to the tune of hundreds. Follows worked with aerodynamics genius Adrian Newey, who is considered the best aerodynamicist in F1 and is responsible for leading the team in the design of the RB18, which won both the Drivers' and Constructors' Championships last year. What the Formula One scene is now having difficulty with is how to regulate the flow and transference of knowledge from one team to another. The staff definitely retains the memories of the designs of previous teams. Hence the question, was Fallow's knowledge of the RB18 the reason for the similar design in the cars? Or was there any additional help, as implied by Dr. Helmut Marko? Marko, a very dramatic figure at Red Bull, had this to say. It's true that what Fallow's had in this head cannot be erased. Copying is not prohibited, but can you copy in such detail without having documentation of our car? We had 3 Red Bulls on the podium, and only the last one with a different engine. With Aston Martin, to what extent have the regulations been violated, if at all have they been? Finally, despite the similarities between the two cars, Horner doesn't regret allowing Follows to leave Red Bull. When asked if he regrets allowing Follow to leave the team, Horner said, "No, because I think we have a wonderful team, and everything has to evolve, nothing stands still. And I think that it's flattering to see the resemblance of that car to ours. So it was great to see the 3 of them on the podium." He also applauded the Aston Martin team for all the hard work they put into developing their car, and he was excited to have more competition at the front of the grid. It's worth noting that Red Bull hasn't filed a formal complaint with the FIA, and when asked about what he said concerning the AMR23, Marko said, "It's not meant to be an accusation either. They're only humorous comments because if you look at the grid, Aston Martin is the car that's most similar to us." We can all agree that the RB18 is the source of inspiration for the AMR23. Another fact is that there are employees in the Aston Martin camp who previously worked at Red Bull. Not to mention Aston Martin has a reputation for copying other cars. You can draw your conclusions from that, but it isn't enough to say for certain that they've cheated unless there is evidence, which there isn't. Red Bull can't involve the FIA unless they have significant grounds and evidence to show. So it's only a war of words and jabs for now. The season's just started, and we can expect a lot to unfold concerning this Red Bull and Aston Martin drama. We can't wait to see how competitive the AMR23 is and find out if Red Bull should indeed be worried. Subscribe to the channel to get all these updates. Also share with us your thoughts on whether Red Bull is right to say that Aston Martin copied their car. And until next time, goodbye.